Okay, it looks like we're live. I'm being told that maybe my internet connection is slow today. I'm going to go ahead and just proceed and record this. I believe it will eventually upload to YouTube, and hopefully you'll be able to see it after. Hopefully it will correct in the process, so I apologize if there's technical difficulties. Let me know in the chat if things are coming through. I'm already getting some indications from Christian that they are. Again, this live format, that is the stakes of it, is that sometimes things don't always work, and I'm running off of a cellular internet, so it's not the most stable connection in the world, even though when it's working I get good speeds. So again, apologize about the difficulties here at the beginning, but I think things are starting to look like they are working properly, so I am going to dive into the actual presentation. So hello, welcome to Mission Top today. I'm excited about today's live stream. What follows in today's stream is a draft of a video essay that I have been working on for quite some time, oftentimes putting it off, and developing for this channel. So for the first part of the video today, I will be reading directly from a script with only basic images to accompany things. For the second part of the video, I will for the second part of the video, I'm going to be attempting to articulate the ideas that I have yet to kind of polish. So I will be doing that in more of an off-the-cuff fashion, and then looking forward to your feedback to if the ideas that I'm going to be sharing to finish this essay are landing, if they seem potent, if they're on the right track. And this will be invaluable to me in order to wrap up the essay in the most effective form and get it up to YouTube, hopefully within the next week, complete with video clips, with music, and a nice, polished, more powerful form that I can be proud of and which is hopefully of value to you. So with that said, we will begin. Most movies about the end of the world deal with trying to avert the destruction of the world. Interstellar begins by taking the end of the world as a given. The world is sick and it will die. The questions then that Interstellar explores is if and how humanity can survive the destruction of the world by transcending it to a new one. And it answers those questions in unexpected ways, which I think contributes to the enduring relevance this movie has subtly maintained since its release. As a striking illustrative example, since its 2014 release, no movie has maintained a higher ranking on the IMDb 250 rankings than Interstellar. Particularly good new movies will rank higher for a time when they are recently released and still grow brightly in their novelty, but slowly that ranking will drop as they fade from relevance. Past video essays that have tried to make sense of Interstellar's enduring allure have centered on explaining the complex contemporary physics concepts the movie employs as part of the story. But I don't think that it's at the physical level that the story offers its fundamental insights. If you only analyze Interstellar at its physical level, then it doesn't have much relevance to our lives. Although we do have ecological problems, our planet is not facing the imminent threat of a complete inability to support human life as it is in the movie. And from all appearances, we don't have the viable option of interstellar travel to find a new world. But if you abandon the desire to find a one-to-one physical correlation to our own circumstances and instead look at the patterns of the film, you begin to find helpful correlations of meaning to our own circumstances. Instead of seeing Interstellar as a story specifically about the death of a planet, I suggest we see it instead as a story about the death of a world, and that we broaden the definition of world to mean something more like a way of life, or a worldview, or a culture. It is very much the case that human worlds, in this sense, have and do die. ways of life, ways of understanding the world can cease to promote human thriving. And I wouldn't be the first to suggest that the last few years, particularly 2020, have had all the hallmarks of a way of life, a worldview, our worldview, coming to the end of its life and dying. And that's why Interstellar's story seems to have particular relevance to our lives right now, and why we continue to pay attention to it, although it was released now some years ago. This may sound like a stretch, but I believe the best way to understand Interstellar is as a post-zombie apocalypse story. The zombie apocalypse is a very curious story pattern because it's perhaps the only new established mythological story pattern to emerge in the last century or more. While the zombie fervor seems to have faded for a time from our cultural zeitgeist, for a while there it seemed like every month or so a new film or TV show was being released that in some way related to the zombie apocalypse. Why was that the case? Could it be that our society was obsessed with this story pattern because it was the best articulation of a pattern that society was living through at that very moment? Which means, yes, what I'm suggesting is the possibility that we were obsessed with the zombie apocalypse because we were experiencing the zombie apocalypse. It was happening to us, and thus has already happened in a sense. That may strike you as outlandish, except for the fact that the zombie fervor was accompanied by strange behavior such as zombie walks, as seen in this image. People actually did this. A mass of people would dress as zombies and make a mass procession down city streets as the Walking Dead. When you see people acting out something with symbolic, ceremonial, or ritualistic overtones, pay attention, because they're likely trying to manifest an idea, a feeling that society is struggling to understand and articulate, but lacks words and precise concepts to describe. I've become a believer in the idea that we act out our ideas and embody them in stories far before we understand them, which is why I look to our stories to find the next ideas. And that's exactly what we're doing in this essay. So if you're willing to follow me this far, that the zombie apocalypse has occurred as far as a pattern of behavior within our society, then this means we are already living in a post-zombie apocalyptic world, the world at the end of the typical zombie apocalypse movie. And that is a world where most people are dead, if not physically, then as to the ways that matter, to meaning itself. They are the living dead. But there are always survivors in these movies, a small amount of people who somehow manage to stay alive in all senses of that world, or word. Are you and I among these? We can only hope, of course, but we shouldn't be so sure. And these few living then have the hope of keeping the world alive. But that's where the movie always ends, most likely because in some sense we don't know what comes next. Which brings us back to the point that started our discussion of the zombie apocalypse. Interstellar is a story that picks up after the zombie apocalypse, after the mass of men have died due to something to do with human pride, overconsumption, and weakness. And very quickly in Interstellar's story, we learn that there's no rebooting this world. There's only one option: leave it altogether. Which again, if we analyze as a pattern that we can abstract and then apply to our lives, would suggest that there's no going back to our old way of life. The kind of world shift we need is so fundamental that it is the symbolic equivalent of finding a new planet in a new universe surrounded by new stars and a new sun. With the death of the world and the zombie apocalypse assumed as a given, Interstellar sets itself up to concentrate entirely on how to escape the dying world and obtain a new one. And the insights that Interstellar explores is where Interstellar's greatest value lies. Surprisingly, the solutions it offers, as we will see, are not scientific, which is ironic because they are dressed up in so much contemporary physics concepts and technology that permeate the story with a sense of futuristic novelty, which on first watch seems to be the essence of the story. And this was the focus of so many early essays on this story. But when you look really close at the story, the solutions are all better described as symbolic patterns of meaning rather than scientific or technological principles. The answers all lie within things that we experience in our daily lives, such as our experience of time, our relationships, our values. Take Cooper's departure in search of a new world. Where exactly he departs to is a matter worth thinking about. Of course, the technical answer is that he departs into our solar system and then another universe in a spaceship. He departs to a specific physical place in space and time. But as I have suggested, I believe this story is best understood in patterns of meaning, not physicality. So where exactly does Coop go at this point? To answer that, consider the significance that space occupies in our minds. Space, as Star Trek tells us, is the final frontier. It is the best thing we now have in our collective conscious for defining the category of the unknown as such. The Earth is what we know, and beyond our atmosphere is the great unknown, an endless expanse of wonders, terrors, aliens, and possibility. That category used to be represented by the ocean for humanity. The ocean was where you found wonders, terrors, and aliens, but also new worlds and the answers to the problems you couldn't solve. The ocean was the unknown. But now the ocean has become familiar enough territory in our minds that it has lost some of its potency in representing that category of the unknown to our modern minds. But our experience of the expanse of space, on the other hand, fits it perfectly. So that's where Coop really goes in the story, into the unknown. And as in so many stories, that unknown, that undiscovered country, has also been associated with death. And so we shouldn't be surprised that from the point that Cooper departs into the far reaches of space, Coop's relationship with Murph at this point is very much like our relationship with the dead. We try to maintain faith that once our ancestors have moved on to the unknown, that they're still there, that we'll see them again, that we'll hear from them. But of course, we can't test that, and we can't communicate directly. Rudimentary binary pings on an annual basis only, as Interstellar says. And time doesn't work the same for them and us. They don't age, but we do. And so we send them thoughts and prayers and hope that they're receiving them, but of course, we can't know for sure. And yet, if we pay attention, just as in the story, perhaps there is a way that they can communicate with us. But more about that later. As the story progresses into the unknown of space, it soon becomes apparent that there is a deepest, darkest, blackest part of this unknown. In other stories, this may have been represented as a cave, or the deep bottom of the ocean, or the darkest, most forbidding part of a forest, or the belly of a beast or monster. But for our modern minds, once again, we have merely substituted some of our more recent scientific discoveries as representations for these categories of meaning that used to be represented by more terrestrial phenomena. Today, for the modern mind, the deepest, darkest place imaginable would, of course, be a black hole. The place of darkness so powerful that nothing has ever ventured there and returned. And even light itself cannot escape its pull. And its fitting monstrous name in Interstellar is Gargantua. But what always lies in the deepest, darkest place? If you know your stories, you already know. It's, of course, the Holy Grail, the treasure, the great secret, the answer, the source code, the golden ball. And in Interstellar, it's no different. The deepest, darkest place contains the unglimpsed singularity, the hidden knowledge vital to allowing humanity to obtain a new world. And when you remember that in Interstellar, this descent into the darkest place comes about through a willing act of taking responsibility by coup, and an act of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. And that in this willing acceptance of descent into death, a new life is made possible for humanity, you begin to see just how fundamental and familiar Interstellar's patterns of meaning are, because that kind of pattern of meaning is the foundation of the Christian Western world. With these examples, you begin to see how under Interstellar's scientific and technological veneer, the story is really driven by patterns of meaning. But so far, we've only talked about patterns of meaning that have been manifest in our stories for millennia now, and which we should already be familiar with. And while the repetition of these patterns suggests the continued relevance of these patterns, especially when it comes to the problem of obtaining a new world that Interstellar is dealing with, I felt that Interstellar continues to intrigue us because it offers newer patterns of meaning that have only more recently begun to emerge into our collective consciousness. Okay, so that is the more written down, kind of locked in, although I'm constantly editing it, portion of this video essay that I'm making. So now I'm going to transition more to the off-the-cuff thinking, where I'm not just going to be reading the script, although I will be using profusely my notes on the different subjects that I'm going to cover, these new patterns of meaning that I think Interstellar is exploring. And so just for those of you that have just recently gotten here and are kind of wondering what's going on, I'm giving you basically the rough draft of a video essay that I'm trying to wrap up and offering it to you to put out the ideas out there, get your feedback, and kind of also these things force myself to kind of have the impetus to get these things done. So again, let's dive in now to the new patterns of meaning that I think are contained within Interstellar, and which is why people keep on watching this movie and keep on thinking that there's something there, there's more there, there's something important here. But as of yet, I haven't seen many people be able to articulate just what. So that's what this essay is going to be all about. So the first major concept explored out in the unknown, or that is explored, I think, in a new and interesting way, is that of time. And a whole video essay could be devoted to Interstellar's exploration of time. And indeed, at least one has. There's an excellent video essay out there by Like Stories of Old, who has a great channel. I've enjoyed many of his video essays, and he focuses entirely on Interstellar and time, so I'm going to leave that entire focus to him. His essay focuses on how Interstellar brings out the grief and melancholy we face when we are forced to deal with the consequences of our consciousness seemingly being imprisoned within the flow or the arrow of time. And that's what this image that I've got up here is supposed to represent. What I will say about time here is that the nature of time is something we seem to be deeply concerned with right now as a society, as it's been featuring frequently in our stories. And so at the beginning of the essay, I said that maybe one of the only new mythological patterns that's emerged in storytelling has been the zombie pattern that has arisen into, profuse storytelling being used over and over. But as I was just writing this today, it made me realize that the time travel pattern is something that we just can't leave alone, can't we? I mean, every month it seems a new movie is coming out that deals in some aspect with time travel or time dilation or time loops, which to me, again, as I indicated in the essay, I think indicates that we know that there's something, we have an idea, we're trying to learn something, and we know that it is through our stories first that we must kind of live through an idea again and again to try to then be able to eventually come and do something like an essay and articulate what that idea is. And so what is this idea that we keep on addressing and that Interstellar addresses through all of this time travel and the relativity of time, and then the exploration that perhaps time doesn't even exist, because that is a new and novel idea being brought into the fore by thinkers such as Donald Hoffman, if you've caught him, who is convinced, he's a serious scientist trying to approach things from a completely scientific perspective, but he's convinced that time doesn't exist, time and space don't exist in the way that we think they do, and instead are part of something that can be best understood as a user interface for us to understand or to be able to handle reality in chunks that we can handle at once, because without that interface, we wouldn't be able to handle the full expanse of reality. So the use of time in Interstellar in so many recent stories that deal with the end of the world and the beginning of the new suggests that we have a sense that our understanding of time is bound up with our ability to progress to a new and better worldview. It's as if we feel that we need to figure out this new idea about time in order to progress to a new world. And so some recent other examples of this that have been in my mind about this idea of time, that we feel like time, we must get this new idea of time if we want to reach a new world, that we feel we need a new way of life, we need a new world, but our concept of time is bound up with this. So if any of you have caught the Netflix series Dark, which I also hope to do a video essay on, we see this same thing. It's all about this travel through time and trying to remap time and the events of time to make things go right. It's always about trying to avert a destruction of a world and make things and obtain a new and better world. That's kind of the entire premise of Dark, is that people are constantly weaving in and out of different moments of time, trying to influence events to prevent a bad world and to achieve a better world. So if you think about our situation today, we are in a time where we look to the future and we see the possibility of a very bleak world right now in our society, right? And so there's that pattern right there. We're all feeling the possibility, the imminence, or the upcoming in the future of a bleak world, and we feel like we need to avert it. So how do we avert it? Well, one of the answers is that part of averting that world in the future lies in the past. If we could adjust the events in the past, then we could avert that bad world and perhaps obtain a new world. Okay, and so in a sense, we start entering into, if you notice, we're not, of course today, none of us are traveling physically through time, but there is a way in which, and I think it's the more important way, in which we very much can travel through time right now. And this is what I think we're doing in all these stories. We travel through time in the sense of meaning. The meaning of different events in time is always up for grabs. The past can always be reconceptualized as far as its meaning. And the future can always be reconceptualized as far as its meaning. And so there you see, we can travel into the future and change its meaning. We can travel into the past and change its meaning. And depending on how things are changed in the past or the future, the rest of reality as we experience it in this life also changes. Okay? And so a movie example of this is the latest Christopher Nolan film, Tenet, okay, which again took a number of viewings and video essays that I had to watch just to kind of get what was going on. But if you kind of zoom out and say, what was this movie really about? Well, it was about a battle in time, you could say, with one force trying to avert a bad world by kind of destroying the past in a sense. That was their only hope, is destroying the past to avert the bad world in the future. And then there's others that want to preserve the continuity of the timeline as it's already been, because they don't want that the past continuity of the timeline to be destroyed. Okay? And this is what, and if you take that pattern, again, out of that movie and put it onto the world as we're experiencing it right now, I would argue that that is exactly what is going on right now in our daily lives. Okay, and here's one example, a concrete example of that. Maybe some of you have heard of the 1619 Project that was released by the New York Times in this last year. So the 1619 Project was a project where they posited that we need to reconceptualize history, American history. You know, we say that this country started in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. Well, we want to argue that that is not the case. That in fact, this country, this world, our society actually began in 1619 when the first boatload of slaves came to the continent. And the reason, you know, they want to show that that is the founding event, that is the central event, is because if that's the central event, if slavery is the essence of our whole culture, then that changes our entire world now, doesn't it? And the way that we view ourselves. If our entire culture was built upon a sin, if you will, and it's funny how religious this stuff gets, because it's very much like an original sin in our culture, then our entire culture in every aspect, if that's where the seed of our culture, then the rest of the culture is a culture just dripping and infused with this original sin. But the only difference, of course, is that as opposed to the Christian story where there is a redemption from this sin, there is a repentance, there is a savior figure that can get people out of this sin. In this conception of the sin, there is no repentance, at least not that anybody accepts thus far, right? And so you see that if people can do that, if they can travel back in time and plant an idea, alter an event, alter a conception of meaning, then it essentially destroys a world. And they of course are doing that because they think in some way it will lead to a better world, right? This is just like in Tenet, where people are traveling back into the past in order to try to change events, in order to avert a bad world and hopefully produce some better world. But of course, that better world is never really explained. In the end, it looks an awful lot just like the destruction of a world. And then there's other forces, of course, that are trying to say, no, let's preserve the timeline as it was right now. And it's, you know, there have been errors in the timeline. There are bad things. And yes, we see how right now we're on a trajectory. We could be on a trajectory to something bad. However, why don't we make it so that we learn from this past timeline instead of trying to destroy it? Learn the patterns of meaning that are there and try to craft a better vision of the future. Okay. Two more examples of that, just to hit this home, are the movies Back to the Future and Black Panther. And I did a video essay on this if you want to check it out, where in Back to the Future, you start with somebody who has a bad world that they're confronted with. And you know, that's Marty McFly, and he sees that his family is just he's humiliated of his family. His father's a joke. In fact, his whole family is a joke. And it's seen that this lie, you know, the reason for that and the reason for his bleak future prospects, the world that he's looking to in the future, is because of past events. So what does he do? He travels back to the past to change the story of his family. And by changing the story of his family, his whole world changes, and suddenly there's prosperity in it. So there's something very true about that. And that's what I think we've been exploring in these kinds of stories. And so bringing it back to Interstellar, how is this happening in the story? Well, what I think Interstellar is doing is teaching us that there is value to realizing that time doesn't exist in the ways that we think it does. That in fact, we can transcend time in the way that we usually think about it and start living simultaneously in both the future and the past at once. So you see that in Interstellar, as the solution to the film, the way to obtain this new world eventually comes down to this moment where everything's focused in on the room of his daughter, on Murph's room. And in that moment, all time is at play. He can travel through time to any moment, right? And Coop in the story is able to transmit the source code through that time. So right there in that moment, you know, past, present, and future are all bound up together. And the future, of course, is these bulk beings that are influencing the story as well. And so you see that in the story, the solution, the final kind of culmination in the story that leads to the solution that leads to the new world comes about by both Cooper and Murph and the bulk beings all being able to interact across time. And we are told that there's two ways to do that. It throws out the scientific way, gravity, that we have posited as a theory today that can somehow go through time. And that's a cool idea, but there's not much we can do with it right now. And so they have this other idea that what else can travel through time? Well, love can travel through time. And some people have made fun of that concept. They kind of focused on, there was kind of a bad delivery by Brand in that part of the movie. But I think they could have done better with it, and a better concept would have been something more like agape, which is a godly love, the love of care for other beings, of wanting other beings to grow and progress. And so interestingly enough, that kind of love can be transmitted across time. That love of care, there's a way that our ancestors can care for us, or they did, into the future, and we can care for them back into the past. There's ways that our posterity in the future, and that would be the bulk beings in Interstellar, can care for us. So if you consider, why did the bulk beings do what they did in the story, in terms of opening up the wormhole and giving these, starting the path of the story, opening up the way for things to happen, they had to have done it because they cared, because they loved their ancestry, you could say. Okay, so that leads to the next kind of major theme that I think is there within Interstellar that I want to explore. And the kind of title for the theme that I have for it is to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. So this follows naturally from this play with time. If, as Interstellar shows us, that the constraints of time don't actually exist as we have accepted them in the past, where we have this notion we can't change the past, we can't change the future, we're only in the moment. If in fact that is untrue and we can live in the future, at least as to what matters, the meaning of the future, and if we can live in the past and travel into it as far as the meaning of it and change the meanings of the past, that means that that we can also interact with the other beings that are both in the future and in the past. Who's in the past? That's our ancestors, right? And who's in the future? That's our posterity. And so I think the story is suggesting that if we want to obtain a new world, we have to turn our hearts both ways and realize that our ancestors and our posterity actually do care about us right now. And here's another way that I mean by that. So I've been kind of talking about traveling through time in a sense of meaning. But like I said, there's scientists who are working very seriously. Again, serious scientists, Donald Hoffman would be one, and he points to other serious physicists right now who are positing that time and space don't exist in the fullest sense. And so if that's true, if time doesn't exist like we think it does, then that would suggest that these, in essence, our ancestors are still there in a sense, and our posterity is already there, even in a physical sense, right? And if that's the case, if they are already there, if they already exist, then not just in a sense of meaning, but in a real sense, then wouldn't we be able to, in some way, communicate with them, right? And that's what the story, again, of Interstellar is suggesting, that our posterity and our ancestors exist right now, and that, in fact, we can communicate with them. But there's only certain things that we can communicate through time. Again, gravity, in the story, it's gravity and care or love. But that's actually enough to communicate quite a bit, which is what we're going to get into. Another thing that this brings up, that's kind of one of these mind-blowing concepts to consider, is that if you can accept that time doesn't exist as we think it does. And Interstellar is suggesting that, and it is a serious idea out there right now. Again, I can't claim that it's exactly the case, but it's just an idea. But if that idea is true, that time doesn't exist like that, and if our posterity then already exists, right? And if, like in Interstellar, you accept that humanity can continue on a course of progress, on a course of evolution that leads to something higher and better, which, is an idea that scientists debate. Is evolution, are we on a track to evolve to always something better? Well, a lot of people say, well, not necessarily. Maybe we could evolve to something worse. Maybe we could evolve to annihilate ourselves. But if you can hold out the thought, I think the hope that most humans have, that we could evolve into something higher and better, and that would be our posterity. Well, if you take time out of the equation, then that higher and better being already exists, right? And that's Interstellar, right? It's positing that if humanity can progress, then humanity already has progressed. And that's kind of an idea that can, at least blows my mind, maybe it'll blow your mind a little bit in that. And so the reason that's useful, the reason that that's helpful to obtaining a new world, is that means that in some way you can communicate with those, with your posterity, with that higher beings. And how can you communicate? Again, it has to do more through things of care and love. But one way that you communicate is by the very existence of your posterity existing as something better. You look to the future and you see something better, something that to move towards, something that draws you into the future, something that makes life here worth it, you could say. And so, and if you notice, the posterity in the movie acts very much like a deity, like you would expect God to act in life, right? That they're influencing us. They're not directly here, appearing to us, just like God doesn't appear to most people, but they're sending signals in the ways that they can. They're showing that they care. And then there's this sense that because they are what humanity could be, they're inspirational. And you see that in Coop when he's in the Tesseract there at the end and realizes that the bulk beings are humanity. It's something that makes him realize, we can solve our problems. We can progress to what that is. Just as a very crude example, once you know that something's possible, once humans learn that something's possible, we immediately move towards that and achieve it. Okay, so my example would be a basketball team where nobody can dunk, right? And they've been working on it for a long time, but they've basically given up because they're all too short. No one can dunk. But in walks, Billy one day. Billy's a stupid name. In walks Scott one day, and he comes and he, dribbles down the court, jumps up, boom, and dunks it, right? And so what do you think is going to happen in the next week? All the other members of the basketball team are going to be able to dunk, within that next week, because that's just the way that we work. So you can see that a new and better world would involve us then in a constant way, living in the past and the future, and in connection then with these beings in the past and the future. And the story of Interstellar has that. It's giving you a story where that is taking place. There is an interaction between the past and the future. And one thing I should make clear is that Coop becomes the ancestor in that story. And the story totally suggests that, leads to that. Cooper becomes the ghost, right? He is the ghost at the first of the movie. And the word ghost, just as it's used with Holy Ghost in the King James Version of the Bible, comes from Geist, is related to Geist, which means a spirit. And in the Bible, spirit is bound up with concepts of breath and wind and pattern. So he basically becomes a spirit in this movie, and it's in that spirit way that he is able to then interact with Murph through that. And you can see how that's very much in the same way that they're interacting with the future posterity as well. And one more thing on that is that the movie has it that they're interacting through love. But look specifically how it is that Cooper influences the story in the movie. He uses these books. It's in this room, in this girl's bedroom, and he uses these books to push him out and send messages. Well, notice, what are books? Books are messages from the past to us, right? It is our ancestors communicating with us. And then the story, also the climax of the story, contains him realizing that because he can send his love through time to Murph, his care, then there's got to be something in which that will carry that care, that he can transmit the source code through. And what does it end up being? A watch. And it wasn't just any watch, it was the watch that he gave her, which he gave her when he departed. And so it wasn't just any watch, right? That watch, the minute he gave it to her, that the father gives this watch to a child, it becomes a magical watch. And it's not like any other watch, right? It is a watch imbued with a special power because he infused that power into it, you could say, is how it works. And so he knew that she would eventually get the watch and look at it, and through that he could transmit the source code. Well, what are those kinds of relics or talismans that have been left to us from our ancestry in the world? It is our books. They've transmitted incredible amounts of information to us through books. But look around, what else have they left to us that are transmitting information to us from the past to our current situation? And I would say, look at a stone circle, for instance. Is that still transmitting information to us? I think a lot of people miss it, but if you go there, you realize that still has power there. And there's still a pattern in that stone circle. If you look at how the stone circle is structured, what it's bound up with, what they used to do there, as you learn more about it, you realize that there's patterns of meaning bound up in that simple stone circle. You realize that they came there in order to form into a people, to commune, to make present important ideas. And as you learn that, those stones still can transmit that to you. I mean, that's a simple example, but of course you go to a cathedral and it's a much more complex example. So our ancestors put tremendous time and money infusing these stones, because almost every cathedral is made of stone, with information, you could say, with care. When they built them, oftentimes they weren't finished in their lifetime. They knew they were building it for their posterity. And then they took these structures and things like it, and they infused them with all sorts of information that could then continue to transmit to us and show us essentially the source code. Because what do all these temples, these structures transmit? They always have an origin story to them. They always show a hierarchy of being to them and show lower beings and higher beings. They always are filled with stories that transmit important principles, mythological stories that have, the very essence of our society. Christian, I'm looking at your comments, and you're saying, buildings and art, and say, yes, architecture was seen as kind of the first interactive, art or way of conveying information. And so buildings themselves, they used to, they've become so devoid of meaning these days, but they used to. That's why you can go into a building, like a building on a university campus that was built as kind of a temple of learning, and you can feel a power when you're in that building. You want to go study there because it's infusing, an energy into you, to risk sounding a little bit woo-woo and new age. Well, it's not new age. You guys have all experienced it. There are certain buildings that lead you to experience a certain experience. And so, look how buildings can transmit information to you. They can transmit experiences. So that all this was focused around this turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. And that's taken from a verse in Malachi at the end of the Hebrew Bible that says that needs to happen, before some new world occurs. So it's exactly the same message, that we have to start caring and learning and bringing our ancestors into our lives on a constant basis. The movie Coco is another perfect example of how this works, of how you bring the spirits of your ancestors into your lives. And it's also, Coco, that's another version of how you go back into the past and change your family's story. So if you look at Coco, he went and investigated his father, or I guess it was his grandfather, his ancestor's story, which had messed up the family and made them shoemakers instead of musicians. So what does he do? He goes into the spirit world, learns about the patterns that are there, and comes up with a new story for the family, which leads the family to both bring all the spirits of the family together into their life, and it turns the family into musicians, right? And instead of shoemakers. So you can see how this works. This is all over the place in our stories if you know where to look. And you can see why it's hard for me to put it into an essay. This has taken me like 20 minutes just to put out these ideas, and they're a lot harder to put into a succinct, written 10-minute form. Let's see what Noah S. had to say. Your concept of time isn't 100% of what we think it is, and our ancestors may be living. What's the moral of the story? Or how could such a mindset help? So, sorry for not getting the whole idea. Okay, so to try to reiterate how this helps, it's that, our ancestors, you could say they're out there, like Coop is in Interstellar, since this all relates back to Interstellar. Coop has gone out there into the unknown. And what is more unknown to us in humanity? What more than death, right? So Coop is out there in the unknown, in death. He's plunged in, and eventually he plunges into the darkest place imaginable, a black hole. And in stories, there's always some vital thing to humanity that we need from that place. And a black hole is the perfect example that we can't glimpse into there without going into it. That's where all our ancestors are. But lo and behold, there's a way that they can transmit things to us. So, one way of looking at our ancestors is that they were just primitive. They had superstitions. They believed in silly things. That's what the world has taught us how to view our ancestors, right? And the things that they built, the structures that they built. Maybe they're cool to look at, but they're all about superstitions and sacrifices of animals and people, and look how primitive that is, and it's just dumb ideas. I mean, that's a sense how we're taught to think of that. But if you can understand that, if you can actually realize that those structures are the way that our ancestors are actually transmitting information to us today, because here we are today, and those structures still have this ability to transmit information. If we can know how to read the code, and that's kind of goes to Murph in the story. She was the person that was ready to receive the information that Cooper found there in the unknown. And in the story, again, it's all dressed up in scientific concepts. Inside the black hole was the singularity, the information that's needed to solve physics equations. Well, again, just turn this more to concepts of meaning, and you see that Murph had prepared herself, had studied, you could say, kind of as much as she could, so that she could understand the source code as it was being transmitted to her through what? Through the watch, through this talisman from her father. And so only she was the person that could do it. So what is the moral of that story? Moral of the story is that we need to dig ourselves back into the structures of our ancestors, you could say. What did these churches mean? What did these structures mean? These temples? What did they write down in texts and stuff? Because again, this book, the Interstellar suggests that it's through books that we can understand our ancestors as well. And once we know that, then you can go to these places that our ancestors are still transmitting to us from, these temples, these holy sites, any place that they left something of permanence into the future, and start realizing, here's a pattern here. There's something that's meant to be learned from this. There's a pattern of meaning in this temple. And I can take that pattern and I can live out that pattern in my own life. And it will make my life go better, right? And so it's incredible. It's exactly this story. We can have kind of the source code be sent to us from our ancestors, from the dead, from the spirit world where they are, and hence be transmitted the way to live that will lead to what? To lead to a better world, transcending of this world to a better world. And I think that's exactly what's happening in the story and exactly what we're trying to do right now. Yeah, Christian, he's got it right. He says, my intuition is you may be trying to fit too much into one essay. C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery. No, I completely agree. That's why I've been working on this essay for a couple years. And I agree, it's too much. It's funny, though, I still feel like I should try, just because even though we've been hashing this over, for 20 minutes, I really do think I've even got paragraphs written that it could be condensed, everything we've said over half an hour almost, or 20 minutes, could be condensed down to 5 minutes maybe. And yeah, it would be really condensed, and maybe a lot of people wouldn't understand it at first, but I still want to do it and put it there. And then maybe you're right, like I should make another essay that's just about one of these topics. And I think I will, but by using other movies, because some other movies hit one of these topics like really well, like again, like Coco hits it really well, or the Dark series in Netflix, or whenever some of these hit them really well. So I'll do the individual concepts in those movies. But Interstellar, again, it's incredible because it stayed like on the IMDb 250, which I think is a really good ranking system. It stayed as the highest ranking movie since it's been released, and that's weird because it wasn't, in the mind, in culture, it wasn't that kind of great movie. But it's because I think it has so many of these ideas in one place, and we're still digesting them. Interstellar still has a big search ranking in YouTube because people are still trying to explore it. So I both agree with you, but I think I still might try to wrap up this essay and just get it done because I've been thinking about it for far too long, as you can tell. Okay, let's transition to another topic then, because it's another key part of the story. And that is that, let me orient myself here real quick. Okay, this is the very opening image of the film that I'm putting up right now. And if you notice, there's actually a lot of information being conveyed here. It's a very strange opening image. It's in Murph's room. You have this dust falling, which kind of conveys that mystical and meaning part of the story. But you also have, and you have these books, which you'll notice most of the books are kind of more focused on the humanities. But then you have this rocket and you have this space shuttle. You have these technologies right there at the same thing. And from the very first opening scenes of the film, and Jonathan Pajot, who I like, he has a very good recommendation for the openings of films, and that's that you pay attention to the opening moments of the film because very often the film lays out its entire structure of meaning in the first moments of the film. And I think Interstellar does that really well, and if you'll go back and watch it, it's a very strange opening. It jumps all over, but has all the things that we're talking about. So here it's in Murph's room, and you have this juxtaposition of science and technology right next to the humanities, you could say, and the mystical with the dust falling. And so throughout the whole film, that's this juxtaposition that it's also putting up to each other. You get in the film and you think, oh, this is science fiction, this is all about physics, this is a scientific film. There's this problem, we need to get to the new world, and here's the obvious way to do it. It's through science, right? It's through physics. We've got these bright people, these PhDs working on it. They're referred to as the best of humanity. And it's even, the same actor of, what's his name? The one who eventually, Dr. Mann, and I'm forgetting, his name, but he's the same actor as in The Martian, right? And that whole movie was exactly about science helping you overcome, the greatest of problems, where he says, we're gonna science the shit out of this, right? Because that was the attitude of The Martian, and everybody cheers and stuff like that. So that's kind of what we're made to believe in the movie, is that science is going to solve everything. And if you look at the world, That's a very common notion. This is the Silicon Valley kind of view of the world, that science and technology are the answer. We are going to forge into the new world with the greatest technologies, and through AI will be the next answer that will lead us, and we're going to interface with AI, and we're going to reach this next great phase of humanity. Matt Damon, thank you, Christian. That's who the character is. But it's kind of, what I love about Interstellar is it's kind of tricking you, because while it leads you down that path, from the very opening moments, there's this other feeling. There's this ominous, mystical feeling. And the very first thing Murphy brings up is the ghost, right? And very first thing Coop says, ghosts don't exist, right? And there's this interplay then in the movie of kind of science and technology up against the mystical and the religious, you could even say. Because even though, like, even the director claimed, oh, this is a very religious movie, and the organ music, which of course feels ominous and religious, it's not really supposed to be a religious movie, but of course it is. I mean, how could it not be with that kind of thing? It doesn't bring up God ever, but this is definitely a religious movie. But it's a religious movie juxtaposed to science and technology, and that's what makes it so potent, because the story kind of has a battle between those two. And as if you know my thinking, of course, I think in all battles, there's bound to be an element of truth in both. Of course, we still need science and technology. That is part of the answer to the new world. But I love where the story takes it, because it leads you down this path in thinking that Dr. Mann and Professor Brand, the older Professor Brand, have things all in the bag through physics, through science, etc. And then comes this, and even Coop, his inclination is towards science. And initially, when things come in that aren't scientific, he tries to shut them down, both with Murph. But then you'll notice even he breaks down sometimes into non-scientific thinking. Like in the bedroom scene before he departs out into space, him and Murph have this interaction. And it's one of the key moments of the film, and he is trying to explain, scientific concepts. Time's going to run different for us, and this and that. And the thing he knows he can't say is scientifically is that he's going to come back, right? But he knows that that's what makes things, when it comes out that that's what's most distressing for Murph. He breaks down at the end and he says, "Okay, you listen. I am coming back," right? And so that kind of colors the rest of the movie, because it brings in something very non-scientific to the whole story, a story of meaning, a story of a father willing to do anything to get back to his children, to try to save them, but also to reunite with them. And so that drives the story, because we get to Dr. Mann and the point where you realize that this whole structure of trying to save humanity was really just a farce, right? And it was performed by the scientists. And you have to ask, what is it trying to tell us, to show us that Dr. Mann and Professor Brand had concocted this giant deception? Okay, and they tell you exactly what they were all about. Okay, they say, we did it so that the species could survive. There's no other way. Okay, and so they say we were willing to sacrifice our humanity in order to save the species. Now, why would they have such an idea? And I'd say because if you put science as at the top of your hierarchy as far as how you think, then that is about the only idea you can come to. Because when you look at science for what it is, science can't provide you a value system. It can't tell you what's right and what's wrong, except for one thing. There's only kind of one predominant value system I've seen scientific theory being able to provide, and that's in the theory of evolution, right? Which has as its primary value survival. And so that's why I think the story moves that the scientists, those most dedicated to science, eventually only have one value above all others, and that is survival. And they're willing to sacrifice all other humanity's values in order to try to ensure this survival. And it ends up with them both acting in ways that are deplorable. Some people might call them courageous, but they end up being deplorable, especially the way Dr. Mann ends up acting cowardly and even just trying to save himself, survive himself. Okay? So what I think that's trying to show us is that if we try to have science and technology lead our value system, we're asking them to do something that they cannot do and will only lead to ruin. And that is what the story teaches. Where on the other hand, if you realize that above science is a higher realm, and that is the realm of meaning and value, that directs science, what we should direct science to, then that will lead you to a new and better world, because that's ultimately what Cooper does. He ends up, even though he's a scientist, he incorporates all these non-scientific, value-laden, meaning-laden principles into what he's doing, and it ultimately, again, he falls into these patterns of mythological patterns where what does he do? He sacrifices himself. He plunges himself into the deepest, darkest place, not even knowing that he's going to help anything. At that point, he was just trying to help Brand be able to live on and whatnot. And by doing that, by performing that act of sacrifice for the betterment of others, because you notice he performs a sacrifice, Dr. Mann was not willing to do that, then the source code is found, right? So I think the story is trying to tell us that it's not like science and technology are bad. That's still used throughout the story. But if it's placed at the top of the hierarchy, then bad things will happen. And that's how atomic bombs get made, because you start going down and saying, well, if science can do it, then it's right, or some of those, rather than having the realm of meaning tell you, no, there are certain things science should never do because they're wrong and they won't lead to good things. And so that leaves the final thing. Well, what about this thing about survival? And I think one idea that the story is trying to push on us is that no, science, even if you take it from a scientific perspective, it's not just survival that is the most important thing for humanity. Like, we've gotten to a point where I think that it's not just that we survive as humans, but it's how we survive. That there is a value infused in it, that we don't deserve to survive unless we can do it through progressing morally in terms of morals, wisdom, principles in that way. So I want to try to fit that into this essay. And finally, we have the section that I'm going to call, the fundamental answer is in the lies in a little girl's bedroom, with the relationship of the father and the daughter. Christian brought up with that last section, remind me of Pajot's video on Follow the Science. And yes, if that stuff with science didn't quite hit home, Jonathan Pajot is who helped me to really be able to understand and articulate more why it is that science is necessarily nested in religion, despite people that would hate that idea. But it's inevitably so, because you can't do science without already placing a value system on it, because you have to decide what to do with science. And that always means that you're always going to have a value system, leading you first as to what to do to science. And if you ignore that, that just means that you ignore the value system to your peril, but it's always there. To do anything is to make a judgment, right? And judgment is inevitably a value system. So anyway, go to Pajot if you want to go deeper down that or try to understand that better. But the last idea that I have to present on this is that, the fundamental answer, the fundamental way we get from the world we're in right now, that we know in some way is dying, is perhaps lies in a little girl's bedroom with the relationship of a father and a daughter. Because the very opening scene of the movie is in that little girl's bedroom, and everything focuses in on it. The ending scene with the culmination where the source code is transmitted is Coop interacting with his daughter into that bedroom. In the middle of the film, where also the climactic moment where he's in there saying goodbye to her, it's in that bedroom. And so I think that the movie is suggesting to us that maybe the next world is obtained through something like a father and daughter's interactions in a girl's bedroom. And maybe such things have repercussions across the cosmos, both in a literal sense and a symbolic sense. So in a literal sense, the lyrics from John Mayer's song, Daughters, come to mind, of fathers, be good to your daughters, daughters will love like you do. And I think there's something going on in society right now that both literally and symbolically has to do with the father and the daughter, right? Because the father, what does the father represent right now? The father represents culture, the past. That's why we hear about the patriarchy so much, that there's this anger toward the father, right? That we see in this story. And then there's the daughter. And what is the daughter so often like in these movies? Because think about how many movies recently have had father-daughter interactions. Interstellar, we've had Blade Runner 2049. Raya and the Last Dragon was actually kind of a more hopeful one. I think things turned better in that one. Logan had this. Again, not a literal father, but clearly Logan was a father figure to kind of the daughter figure in that one. And you always have these daughters that are exploring this, that in some ways are being masculine, right? Because if you can think of it this way, that right now in our society, we've had very much a kind of daughter feminine spirit trying to figure out what they should be, what their role is. And of course, in the last 5, 6 years, 10 years, the message has been that the answer for the daughter, for the young feminine coming up, is to be more masculine, right? And there's been this preoccupation with proving that women can be masculine, that they can do masculine things. And it's like, okay, point proved. Humans are plastic creatures, and yes, women can be masculine, and yes, men can be feminine. Men can nurture a child. Some men can do it very good, right? But these stories always seem to suggest something else. Like there's this other longing, I think, to them. So it's trying to prove that the young feminine can be masculine. It's like Murph. You see her at the beginning, she's kind of a tomboy. She's getting in fights at school. She's interested in science concepts, which typically has had this kind of masculine feel to it in society. And so, and then there's this conflict between her and her father. And again, I think that is one of the things that's lying at this cusp of a new world right now in our society, is the relationship of fathers and daughters. Again, both symbolically and literally, because we live out symbolism in our lives. And the other thing that's so curious about these stories is that so often the mother is missing. She's dead, right? She's out of the story in a big way. So here, and then very commonly when the mother's out of the story and missing, notice how in Interstellar the earth is also in essence dead, and it no longer is producing in a fertile way. So look at the movie Moana. It has all these same patterns, right? The movie opens with the masculine kind of, pulling the feminine spirit out of her, and the earth turning to a spreading darkness where it's losing all its life force. So that maternal feminine life force is kind of gone from the world. And then you have this conflict between a father and a daughter. And then you have this daughter trying to act masculine, and prove that she can be masculine. But in the end, the movie's all about trying to restore the heart of femininity, which lies more in a mother kind of fertility and femininity at the end of the story. And that story has had it. Blade Runner 2049, same thing. The movie is all about a playing of a father-daughter relationship, a mother who's dead, an earth that is dark and devoid of green and lush and fertile life. And the question is, what is the answer to achieving a new world? So it's in that. The movie Dark plays with these kind of things different ways. So these father-daughter stories are all over the place, which again suggests to me that they are part of what we need to figure out as society in order to figure out a better way of life here going forward. And so elements of this is that in the story, in essence, Murph, what's kind of so cool about her character, which what I love what Interstellar did with it, is it has her being this kind of tomboy, masculine. She has this conflict with her father, but in the end, what does she end up doing? She ends up trusting in her father, and she ends up, all her most key actions are tied into more of a feminine type of action. She holds out this faith that her father is still out there in the world, and she proceeds forth on that faith, on an intuition, right? You hear about a woman's intuition. Intuition is very much more a feminine kind of concept, a motherly kind of concept. So he runs on that. She is open and driven by her emotions and her feelings, and of course emotions and feelings have this feminine aspect. And in the end, we have her placing this ultimate faith in her father and reaching this reconciliation, where in the final moments of the film, what we get to with Murph is that she has kind of achieved, she's gone from the young feminine kind of spirit that proved they could be masculine, but ultimately went down a feminine path to end up as something more like a mature maternal spirit. And you have them in this ending scene of the movie with, in that room, her surrounded by her posterity. And it's as if this maternal, kind of spirit has been brought back to the world and is infused in the culture, right? Where everybody recognizes the value again of this maternal spirit. So what does that suggest to me? That suggests that in our world today, one thing that we are kind of grappling with, and again, it's in our stories, is that we have lost the maternal spirit, you could say, to the world. And we can't even, we've lost it because we can't even explain it. Try to get anybody to explain what femininity is. Of course, feminists have been focusing so much on this idea that women can be masculine, that I don't look to feminists to explain femininity to me anymore, because I think they've been so focused on that idea. And we're left here knowing that this kind of feminine, the great motherly feminine spirit is gone from the world. And as part of that consequence, our earth is having these ecological problems where it's losing its fertility, hence why one of the things we're doing here at Mission Top. But anyway, these stories are all dealing with how we kind of re-encounter that divine, mature, motherly, feminine spirit in our lives. And so that's what I loved about this story, is that it leads the daughter to ultimately becoming that mature, motherly, feminine spirit. And then where does the story end up? It ends up with Brand, who's she's another feminine figure, scientist and everything, but look what Brand was being set up as. She's in charge of this population bomb that is kind of the new, seen as a new start for humanity. And she ends up alone on this new planet. And of course, very much lending herself to an Eve figure. And where do we end up with Murph telling Coop to what is the last thing he needs to do? There's this last kind of final step to this whole process. We've rediscovered the maternal feminine spirit. Now Coop needs to go out and unite himself, the masculine and the feminine uniting, an Adam and an Eve kind of moment to start the new world the right way again. And it's kind of a bit of a jumble that way, like in this story, and that's where I'm still trying to wade through presenting that in the right way. But if you look at so many stories right now, you'll see these same things, not only the missing mother maternal spirit that we're trying to get back to, but also this trying to find an Adam and Eve beginning again. So again, Dark, the series Dark, which was very difficult to get through because there's, oh man, they put in so much dark material and gruesome things and whatnot. So it was difficult to get through, but I had a sense that there was a strong symbolic core, and I think it was true in the end, because in the end what happens, it was all about the masculine and the feminine once again reuniting in an Adam and Eve kind of moment to start a better world. And in Dark, there was even an act of sacrifice on behalf of Adam and Eve that led to the beginning of a better world, or a restoring of a better world, I should say, in Dark. So that's about all I've got. And yeah, I've poured this out. You can see, let's see, 1:16, and in the end, this essay needs to be no longer than a half an hour. So you see I have my work cut out to condense this, and Christian, called me out that that's going to be difficult, and I agree, but I really do think it can be done if I'm just use condensed language and symbolism, and it may not make sense to everybody on the first go, but hopefully they'll sense enough in it that they could watch it a couple of times. I mean, I watch video essays a couple times all the time if I feel like if they have that much content in them. So thank you for listening to this. I'm going to head over to look at some of the most recent comments that have come in and see if we can answer any other things hanging out here and wrap this up. Okay, Noah S. I'd imagine that science justifies human behavior from materialistic lenses and sees humans just as robots. And I'd say yes. I mean, that when you go down a scientific path, you see the whole world as materialistic, which ultimately means that we're just a mass of material and atoms and things that somehow came together, and somehow our consciousness comes about, but in the end it's all just this universe of matter and forces interacting. Well, then that means we're not worth much, right? And as soon as you get to any sort of ideology that says that we're not worth much, be prepared, because death will follow, death of human beings. And that's what you get, both on some different polls of, when you get it on the far right with the Nazi system that devalued those that didn't fit into the pure vision of humanity, well, then those die. But you also had it on the communistic side, when that system devalued the individual human's worth. And so it was okay to eliminate whole populations that didn't fit into the conception that they had. And so it's just the same thing with science. If you go down that path that all we are is just meat and atoms and things like that, then it justifies people doing with humans as you wish, and that's very much what can happen. Christian brings up, it's interesting in terms of this theme of continuity of heritage and love between generations, that the other plan was just sending embryos, a brand new start, but something precious lost. Yes, I totally agree. And that's why I think, the movie kind of leaves it open, but it's clear that humanity is being preserved, and they're going to that new world, and they're probably not going to use that population bomb, because it was always the lesser plan. But when you see how Dr. Mann and Professor Brand were willing to do that, you see how it was a plan devoid of something precious, which is the humanity part, our values, our relationships with each other, because they were willing to sacrifice all those people back on Earth. So, exactly right. And we've got a last question from Christian here. Do you find fathering daughters much different from fathering sons? And I would say definitely there is a difference. And that's because, there is masculinity and femininity in both my daughters and my sons, but in the regular course of things, most females have the femininity, again, in the foreground and the masculinity in the background, and it's the opposite for the males. And so, you interact with people in a different way depending whether they're feminine or masculine. Just like I interact with my wife in a completely different way than my buddies on a sports team, right? And so yeah, with my daughters, it's a very different experience. They definitely need more. That gets into what I want to do in future videos, which is really get into the nature of the feminine and what the feminine wants. The feminine wants to be cherished, wants to be loved, wants to be dazzling to the masculine, which means that as a father, there's so much more room to where you just need to, show your daughter that she's worth something, because there's all sorts of forces out there that will try to tell her that she's not, right? Whereas, of course, my sons need that too, to a degree, but there's much more, that sense where they need somebody to sometimes, kind of smack them on the back of the head, not literally, of course, but tell them that, that they're an arrogant, they're acting like an arrogant little boy, and they need to, pull up their britches and start acting in a manner that they could be proud of, or something like that, So that's just a small example, and of course, there's endless examples you can give. But yes, for sure, I think sons and daughters need to be approached differently. I mean, anybody that coaches sports, for example, could tell you that coaching a girls' sports team and a boys' sports team need to be handled in very different manners if you want to have success. And last comment by Wiss is saying, yeah, no one is 100% masculine or 100% feminine. That is one of the things that if only we, society could understand that, because you see how we battle this thing of is masculinity bad and what should femininity be? And if we can only understand that we all are worlds, and any world must be composed of the masculine and the feminine to work, then it would make society go a lot better. But that's why we're here, right? And we kind of end with that each time, is that is the value of these ideas, is that they're ideas meant to be taken out and lived lived in such a way and talked about with other people such that they can spread. I do think they're the ideas that will help our world go better. That's what Mission Top is all about, is trying to figure out what would be a better world at this point. Not in a utopic vision, not a perfect world, because I don't think that notion of perfection is actually desirable, but in a world that would bring us more into a way of life that we could be more proud about as humanity, I guess you could say. Stefan says, do you think the missing feminine mother spirit has influence on the male energy manhood as well? The missing sick mother influence reminds me of the Joker movie. And that reminds me, I haven't seen that movie yet. I should go watch it, because enough was made about, people felt enough about that I should have watched it by now, knowing that it was significant. But as far as to what you said, do you think that missing feminine energy has had an influence on manhood? I would say definitely, because one thing that, as far as kind of a sexual relationship and a symbolic sexual relationship that at least I've experienced and noticed out in humanity, is that we tend to be motivated by and even attracted to that which we lack. And so if you take the masculine, very much is, there is this force that is attracted to the feminine and wants to combine with it in order to form a more whole and better thing that is then that's then fruitful and produces fruit into the world, right? And so if that feminine spirit is missing, then there's something there's a motivation, right? There's an attraction that is missing from men towards that, right? And so that creates all sorts of problems, especially if women who are trying to figure out femininity and instead like kind of acting masculine or something, and then finding that men aren't showing them that type of attention that they actually want, that type of attraction and cherishing that they want, well, then that creates these conflicts of why aren't you treating me like I want to be treated? You know, women and men having a thing of why, you know, why are my energies gone, you could say, that I want to have directed towards this femininity, and why is my energies not there? Well, it's because, yeah, I think that femininity isn't out there as much for it to be directed towards, if that makes any sense. No, I feel kind of lost here since I really watch movies, and that's good to know, because it tells me that the more I do this, hopefully the better I'll get at explaining this, because a lot of these things I'm talking at an abstract level, which I'm kind of used to because that's where philosophy gets you into some kind of legal thinking. So that's kind of where I've been trained, and I try to use the examples, but these are difficult concepts. I mean, these are things that I've had to circle around my brain around for years, literally, and then I'm trying to explain them to you, and they're not always going to come out in the clearest and best way, but the only way to do it for both of us is to make the attempt, right? And then something probably made sense here or was a useful idea, and then we come back and something else clicks. And in the process, I actually learn from this. I mean, that's what's so cool about this process of dialogue, which is why I would love to figure out some way. Maybe one of you could send me an idea or something. My email, by the way, is just garynuila@gmail.com. You'd send me an idea of how we could get this to be something more like, I guess, Clubhouse is shaping up to be, where instead of just text, we could find some way to have audio at the very least. I don't know, I've been mulling around the idea. It is possible to do things in terms of like Zoom and bring in audio and video, but there's some downsides to Zoom, you know, in the face that kind of Zoom is draining because it's unnatural in the way that everybody's kind of stuck there. It's unnatural in the way that we're right in each other's faces, and the way that that you're seeing yourself in an image. So I don't know if Zoom is exactly the option to best bring out a good interaction on this. But so if any of you have a way of knowing how we could bring you in on audio and still into this stream in a way that I would have to be able to control, because of course it could get out of hand really quick, that would be useful to know in case any of you have that kind of expertise. That being the case, though, I think the questions have ended. My brain is drained because it is hard to try to do these things, to try to articulate these things, but at the same time I love it, so that's not a complaint. Thank you for being here, and yeah, I guess that's all we have to do today. We'll see you back tomorrow. Don't know yet what we're going to stream about tomorrow, but you will see once I figure that out.